So, like with a lot of people, I am actually a fan of Formula E. When I first heard about this championship around 10 years ago, god that makes me sound old, yet I'm only 26, I was actually excited for it. The idea of having a Formula series being powered by electricity racing around the world on city streets sounded like a good idea. I remember getting up early on a Saturday morning to watch the first ever race at Beijing, and it's safe to say I didn't regret it. Now look, the race as a whole wasn't exactly memorable, for the most part. In fact, apart from the first ever pit stops, we saw the drivers do what MotoGP does with a flag to flag, which is basically swap cars, there's nothing else from that race I can remember. That was until what happened on the final lap. Okay, maybe I went a bit over the top there with the sound effects. This accident involving Nick Heidfeld and Nicholas Prost, which thankfully Nick was able to walk away from, put the series on the worldwide map. In fact, I'm convinced to this day that if it wasn't for this accident, the series wouldn't have got the recognition that it gets now. In fact, the races that took place after that were very exciting to watch. It was like the series took that accident that gave them huge headlines across the world, and they were able to build on that recognition. So much so that the season ended up having a title decider, which was won by Nelson Piquet Jr., the only Nelson Piquet in the world that isn't an arsehole. The following season would see the series allow the teams to build their own powertrains, and whilst the idea didn't get off to the best of starts, as time went on and the teams were getting more familiar and accustomed to the powertrains, the pecking order became close again. However, whilst this is good, I do believe there are some problems which the series needs to address. Now, as the seasons go on, the series is going to run into problems from time to time, same with any other series. Take for example the old qualifying system they had during the Gen 2 era. Now initially, I actually liked this qualifying system. However, as time went on, it was starting to become clear that because most of the circuits they were racing at were only being used once a year, it meant that the track would get dirty, which combined with the old group qualifying format, which was determined by where the driver was placed in the Drivers' Championship, it meant that they would essentially act as a road sweeper. Now, as we see in WRC whenever they're at a gravel rally, being a road sweeper means you are going to be slow compared to the other drivers in the other groups who will have a clean track. Now thankfully, in the final season of the Gen 2 car, they brought a World Cup style knockout format which has been received positively by fans, and it makes people tune into qualifying as a result. In 2023, Formula E debuted the Gen 3 car, which in my opinion is basically a hybrid of the Gen 1 and Gen 2 cars, with many people also saying it looks like a block of cheese. Wouldn't surprise me if Wallace has one in his garage.
Get off me cheese!
Either way, I do believe these cars look better than the car that was dubbed the Batmobile. However, I do believe there is a huge issue with it. In fact, I would say this issue has been around for quite a while, even before the Gen 3 era. And one race in particular that happened this year exposed that issue. The 2023 Portland E-Prix. It's the 24th of June 2023, and it's round 12 of the 2022-23 Formula E World Championship. Serious question, why on earth do they still refer to it as a super season like the Premier League does, when all the races happen in one year? Why not call it the 2023 Formula E World Championship? Why is that so much of an issue for them? Anyways, enough venting. Going into the race, the championship was once again too close to call, with Pascal Wehrlein leading the championship by just 1 point ahead of Jake Dennis, with Nick Cassidy a further 5 points back in third, and Mitch Evans keeping within touching distance in fourth. The race, as mentioned, would take place at the Portland International Raceway, which is the same circuit that IndyCar races at, usually for their penultimate race of the season, although that won't be the case next year. It wasn't unusual for the series to do races on a purpose-built racetrack, as opposed to the regular street circuits they race at. The purpose-built tracks that they had raced at before Portland was Mexico City at the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez, the Circuit Ricardo Tormo in Valencia, Spain, where they do their pre-season tests at, and Pueblo in Mexico. In fact, it was recently announced that the series would be racing around the Shanghai International circuit next year, and there are even reports that the Italian race, which won't be in Rome anymore, could be replaced by either Monza or Misano. Portland would play host to its first ever Formula E race, and to be honest, I was actually excited for this. In fact, this may be seen as a controversial opinion, but I do think Formula E should now start to do most, not all, but most of the races on purpose-built circuits, as I feel Formula E has outgrown most of the street circuits that they go to. In qualifying, it was Jake Dennis who took pole position, followed by Sasha Fenestraz in second, and teammate and fellow compatriot Norman Nato in third. The DS Penske's of Jean-Eric Vergne and reigning champion Stoffel Vandoorne were scheduled to start in P6 and P10 respectively. However, both were forced to start in the pit lane due to the team running an illegal RFID system on their cars, which was alleged to have gathered data about the team's tyre pressures. However, this would in a way become an afterthought, as the events that transpired in this race would end up being a bigger talking point, at least from what I saw. The race started and Jake Dennis held on to the lead ahead of Sasha Fenestraz, whilst Norman Nato lost third place to the McLaren of Rene Rast. Drivers were constantly switching places throughout the first lap, with Nato even briefly moving back up to third at the beginning of lap 2, only for Rast to hang it around the outside and hold on to third. However, it was starting to become clear as the race progressed that the pack were not spreading out like you would normally see in other series. Now, there was a reason for this, which is one of the issues Formula E has right now, which I believe it needs to address before it gets out of hand. You see, like with other series, Formula E isn't just about the racing. To appeal to the car manufacturers who are racing in the series, which there are a few, the racing that the series produces also involves a lot of preservation. Now, as mentioned, other series have a form of preservation, whether that would be tyre preservation or even fuel preservation. In the case of Formula E, given it's an electric series, it's energy preservation. At the start of each race, drivers have a total of 100% energy, which will deplete as the race goes on. However, the rate that the energy depletes throughout the race is very high, which means if you go full throttle throughout the race, you wouldn't have the required energy usage needed to get to the end. So what's the best way to preserve your energy, I hear you ask? Well, reducing your speed. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with racers having a form of preservation involved, because that encourages strategy. However, Formula E, in my opinion, takes this preservation a bit too far. Now, in Formula E, there is a thing called regen, which is the system within the car that reuses old energy that has already been used throughout the race. This process is done whenever the driver presses the brake pedal in order to get around a corner. Regen is one of the ways that the drivers can preserve energy. However, this cannot be used whenever they are on a straight, given it's a straight obviously, and there are obviously no braking zones on a straight. Again, obviously. Unless you are trying to wipe out someone, which is never a good idea. So how do the drivers preserve energy on the straight, I hear you ask? Well, like this. What you are seeing are drivers backing off on a straight to preserve energy. Now, it's not uncommon to see drivers coasting on a back straight in a race, but this takes it to the next level. Drivers are deliberately choosing not to overtake the leader, who himself is trying to back off to allow people to pass him. Now, the reason for this is because if you are the leader, you are at a disadvantage when it comes to preservation. It's better for a driver to be behind someone, because that way they are able to preserve their energy better due to the slipstream from the car in front. Being in the slipstream allows for the driver to lift off the accelerator without the threat of losing time to the car in front. It's a bit like what you see in the Tour de France, a lot of riders staying in a big pack, whilst 2 or 3 riders pull out a gap in front, only for the large group to eventually catch up in the closing stages of the race. Now, Portland isn't the only race where this was occurring, as there were other races such as Berlin and Sao Paulo where this was happening. However, it wasn't to the extreme like what was happening in Portland. This was so extreme that the drivers were even going as far as to activate their 2 attack modes very early in the race. This would continue for a huge portion of the race, and it even got to a point where because of this pack racing, it led to a few incidents happening in the race, one of which being an accident towards the end of the lap involving the apt of Nico Müller. After 32 laps, Nick Cassidy, after taking the lead in the closing stages, would come through to take his 3rd win of the season, moving him to within 1 point of Jake Dennis, who took the lead in the standings and finished 2nd behind Cassidy in the race. The second place finish would prove crucial for Jake later in the season, as he would go on to win the title by 30 points ahead of Cassidy, whilst Cassidy's win at Portland, combined with his win at the finale in London, would prove crucial in his team Envision winning their first ever team's title. However, the result of the Portland E-Prix was overshadowed by the debate about the pack racing that happened at the race. For me, like with other people I saw on social media at the time, I think what we saw at Portland was a joke, and I fear that if this continues, it will lead to more accidents, and even ones that may put a driver's safety at risk. Now, am I saying that there shouldn't be preservation in races? No, absolutely not. As mentioned earlier, every series has it, and I believe there should be an element of preservation, whether that would be tyres, fuel, or in the case of Formula E, energy, as it does add a strategic element to the races. However, all the other series that have it, such as Formula 1, MotoGP, IndyCar, etc., are not as extreme as Formula E's preservation. I think the main reason for this is because there isn't a mandatory pit stop in the race. It's very clear that the amount of energy the teams are allowed to use is not enough to get to the end of the race without a lot of preservation, which is why we sometimes get this pack racing like we had at Portland, and I think a mandatory pit stop would eliminate this issue. Now, I am hearing that for some races next year, there are plans to have mid-race quick charge to add more electricity into the powertrain and also to add more energy, which is great, but as mentioned, it's only going to be for some races, specifically at tracks that are either purpose-built, such as Mexico, Portland, Shanghai, which will be making its debut next season, and whatever the Italian race will be that will replace Rome, which is believed to either be Monza or Mazzano, or tracks that are in public parks or closed areas, such as Berlin and Jakarta. However, for street tracks, they won't have this mandatory quick charge and will continue to have races without a pit stop, which does worry me. You see, as mentioned earlier, Portland wasn't the only one to suffer from this pack racing. Another example was at Sao Paulo, which is scheduled to once again host Formula E in 2024 after a successful first race. In that race, the pack racing, like we saw at Portland, was very prevalent. However, the difference between Portland and Sao Paulo is that Portland is held at a purpose-built racetrack, whereas Sao Paulo is held on a street track. And given it seems this mandatory quick charge isn't going to be used on street circuits, I do fear this issue is still going to be there in 2024. Now, I hope for future seasons they implement this at every race, so then that way it can hopefully fully eliminate that issue that we saw at Portland and Sao Paulo. Now, I do have another suggestion that Formula E could implement to add more strategy, which is a tyre change, but I haven't got a full picture of what these hand-cut tyres are like, especially in changeable conditions, as when Michelin were the tyre suppliers, they had an issue with the tyres degrading so fast that when it came to changeable conditions, the tyres had no grip in the wet conditions. The most notable example of this was in 2022 at New York, when the top 4 skidded off the track. So, I will hold that thought for the time being until I see what the hand-cut tyres are like in changeable conditions. What do you think Formula E should do to eliminate the pack racing? Do you agree with the quick recharge, or do you think there should be another way? And while you are at it, let me know any improvements you think Formula E should do to make the product better, because the series does have a lot of potential. It's just in my opinion, it lets itself down in a number of areas. Anyways, bring on 2024, and hopefully we don't see any more pack racing, though I'm not holding my breath on that.